sold to pay a tax collector and locked in a cage wagon. A cowboy shot the lock off and gave her open country. The lock was a good one. Sheffield iron, thick shackle, the kind a man buys when he means to keep something. I remember standing there looking at it while the wagon sat in the shade of a dry-rotted livery awning, wheels sunk a quarter-inch into the mud from the last rain, which had been 4 days back. Everything else about that wagon was cheap, warped pine slats, rusted bolt heads, a canvas roof patched with a flour sack. But the lock was good. I had come into Caldwell Flats to sell 2 horses. That was the sum of my business there. The horses were a gray mare and a buckskin gelding I'd picked up off a Comanche trader 3 weeks out of Laramie, and I'd been riding south with them because a man in Caldwell Flats named Dupree had written to say he'd buy. The letter said $22 the pair. Not generous, but honest. I was 48 years old, I had a roan I trusted, $31 in my boot, and a camp kit that was starting to show the mileage. $22 was worth a 2-week ride. I got into town around noon. Dupree's corral was on the north end of the main street, past the dry goods and the assiers. I passed the livery on the way. That's when I saw her. She was sitting on the floor of the wagon bed, knees up, back against the far slats. Maybe 25, maybe a shade less, with dark hair that had been pinned up at some point and was now mostly down, one loose braid over her shoulder. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling out to anyone. She was just sitting there the way a person sits when they've made some internal decision about where they are and what it means, and the decision was grim. Her hands were resting on her knees. She had a bruise on her left cheekbone, old enough to be going yellow at the edges. There was a tin cup tipped over in the corner. The wagon had no water in it. I looked at her, she looked at me. I rode on to Dupree's. He was there. We settled the horses in about 10 minutes. He knocked me down to $19. I took it, we shook. He was civil enough, didn't try to swindle me on the gelding's teeth or make a fuss about the mare's left hind, which had a slight thickening just above the fetlock but was nothing. Good enough man for a horse trader. I pocketed the 19, thanked him, walked back to where my roan was tied at the rail. I stood there with my hand on the pommel for what might have been 2 minutes. I untied him and rode back toward the livery. I want to say there was a calculation in it. Something deliberate and principled I'd worked out while Dupree was counting coins. There wasn't. There was just the image of that tin cup tipped over, and the fact that whoever had put her in that wagon hadn't left her water, and the lock. The good Sheffield lock on the cheap wagon. I didn't know anything yet. I was about to find out things I would have been better off not knowing, in the way you always are before you ride toward something instead of away from it. A man was sitting on an upturned crate beside the livery door. Big fellow, heavyset, wearing a star on his vest that looked like it had been pinned there recently. The fabric around it was puckered like it had been unpinned and repinned more than once. He had a shotgun across his knees, not a town marshal's stance, something else. Hired, maybe, or appointed for a particular purpose. I pulled up. What's she in for? He looked up at me slow. Ain't your concern. Where's she going? Ain't your concern either. I looked at the wagon again. She turned her head toward me when I rode up. I could see her watching from between the slats. She got water. The man with the star shifted the shotgun on his knees. You need to move along. I didn't move along. I'll ask you to tell me her name and what she's charged with. That's a legal question. There's a man with a badge, and I'm asking it plain. He stood up then. He was taller than I'd reckoned, and there was a sort of casual meanness in the way he held himself, the way some men have who have been given a little authority and found they liked the weight of it. She ain't charged with nothing. She's been remanded. Now ride out before I take an interest in you. Remanded, that was the word. Not arrested, not jailed. Remanded, which is a word that sounds official and means nothing except that someone with enough standing has declared a person belongs to them for a while. I rode out. I found the county office at the far end of town, which was also the post office and a barber shop, the 3 enterprises sharing a single low building with 3 different hand-painted signs. The county man was a fellow called Birch, red-faced, reading a newspaper at a desk so covered in paper it looked like a snowfall had happened and only hit his corner of the room. He had a small safe beside the desk and a coffee mug that said Masonic Brotherhood of Wichita in fading letters. I asked him about the woman in the cage wagon. He put down his paper. He looked at me the way officials look at strangers, not hostile exactly, but measuring what kind of trouble I might be and what it would cost to manage it. "That's a tax matter," he said. "A tax matter." Her father died, owed back taxes on land he'd been farming up in the Cutter Creek drainage since 1869. 12 years of assessments, liens going back to 74. Assessor put the land up. Didn't cover the full debt. She was on the land, dependent. She's been remanded to a man named Good, who's covered the remaining debt in exchange for a period of service. He said it straight. No apology in his voice, but no pride either. Just the flat recital of a man who has told an ugly thing so many times it stopped sounding like an ugly thing. "Service," I said. "That is the term used." "And the bruise on her face." He picked up his paper. "I wouldn't know anything about that." I stood there another moment. "What's her name?" He lowered the paper just enough to look at me over the top of it. There was something in his face then, not quite shame, but something adjacent to it, like a man who knows where the body is buried but has made a private arrangement with himself about whether that makes him complicit. "Nora Kane," he said. Then he raised the paper again. I went back out into the sun. There is a thing that happens to a man who has lived long enough and seen enough of what people do to each other. You get a callus on it. Not because you stop caring, but because caring about everything that's wrong in the world would crack you open like a dry log, and you've got your own road to walk. I had walked away from worse than this. I had ridden through towns where things were happening that I had no standing to stop, and no allies to stand with, and nothing but my one rifle and one revolver, and a horse I couldn't afford to get shot. This was different in a way I can't entirely account for even now, except to say that it was a county man telling me a woman's name. Nora Kane. And the way he said it, quiet, like a fact he was half ashamed of knowing. I went to the saloon. Not to drink, though I had one. I went to listen. Good was not hard to find in conversation. In a town like Caldwell Flats, a man who has just conducted a piece of business that most people there know about is either avoided completely or talked about constantly. And there was only one man at the bar talking with the wide, settled confidence of someone who has recently gotten what he wanted. Good was about 60, lean, with the kind of tan that comes from years of outdoor work and a quality of stillness in the face that I have seen in men who are genuinely cold inside. Not violent, not angry, just absent the thing that makes most people hesitate before they hurt someone. He was talking to a younger man about cattle prices. He had a whiskey he was making last. He looked like a man who had already put Nora Kane in the back of his mind and was thinking about tomorrow. I finished my drink. I went to the dry goods and bought 3 things: a canteen, a sack of jerked meat and hardtack, and a box of .44 shells. I went back to the hotel where I'd left my gear, cleaned my revolver, loaded it fresh, and sat on the edge of the bed for a while. My roan was at the livery. Good's cage wagon was at the livery. The man with the star badge was at the livery. I thought about odds. I thought about the law in Caldwell Flats, which appeared to consist of one man with a recently repinned badge and a county official with a newspaper and a Masonic mug. I thought about what Good had paid for the tax debt and what he expected back, and how long a woman could sit in a wagon without water in June heat before it became a more permanent kind of damage. I thought about Nora Kane sitting with her back straight against the slats, hands on her knees, looking at me without asking for anything. I was 50 years short of sentimental. I'd been married once, to a woman who died of fever in the winter of '71, and I had not particularly been looking to get tangled in anyone's story since then. I had the roan and the road and enough to keep moving, which had seemed like enough for 7 years. I picked up my revolver and my rifle and my newly filled canteen and went to the livery. It was past 6. The sun was still up but going, that long, flat light that makes dust look like gold and doesn't do a man any favors if he's trying to see clearly. The man with the badge was still on his crate. He'd gotten himself a bottle since the afternoon, and the bottle was a third down. I came around the corner of the livery with the rifle in my hands, and I said, "Set that shotgun down against the wall and step away from it." He looked up. His eyes went to the rifle, then to me, then to the rifle again. The whiskey had put a slowness in his reading of the situation that worked in my favor. "I will shoot you," I said. "I'm not angry and I won't enjoy it, but I will do it. Put the gun down." He put it down. "Now sit back down on that crate and put your hands in your lap." He sat. I walked to the wagon. She was watching me through the slats, same stillness she'd had all afternoon, but something had come into her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not hope exactly, more like attention. She was watching to see what I was. I looked at the lock. Sheffield iron, thick shackle. I pressed the barrel of the revolver against the shackle, angled up to keep the ricochet away from both of us, and shot it. It took 2 rounds. The second one split the shackle clean, and the lock dropped in the mud. I pulled the cage door open. She didn't rush out. She got up carefully, like a person checking that their legs still work, and she stepped down from the wagon bed and stood on the ground. She was taller than I'd thought, almost my height. She looked at the man on the crate. She looked at me. "Nora Kane," I said. "Yes. I have a horse and a canteen and enough food for 5 days. I'm riding north. You can ride with me, or I can leave you the supplies and you can go whatever direction you choose. It's your call." She looked at me another moment. There was something in the look that I didn't know what to do with. Not gratitude exactly, it was more specific than that, like she was taking a measurement. "North is fine," she said. I got my roan from the livery stall. The livery man was in the back and pretended not to hear the shot, which told me all I needed to know about how he felt about Good's business. And I cut one of Good's horses loose from the wagon traces, a solid-looking dun mare who was better fed than the wagon deserved, and I bridled her with a spare I had in my kit and helped Nora up. We rode out the north end of Caldwell Flats into the last of the evening light. Nobody came after us that night. I don't know if Good came back to the livery and found his man sitting on a crate with his shotgun leaning against the wall and his cage empty, and worked it out. I don't know if the county man and his Masonic mug and his newspaper got involved. We rode until the town was gone behind the low roll of the plain, and then we rode another hour into the dark before I found a draw with a dry creek bed and enough scrub brush for cover, and we stopped there. She hadn't said much on the ride. Neither had I. There's a particular kind of silence between two people who don't know each other but are sharing a serious situation, and it isn't unfriendly, it's just honest. The silence of people who understand that small talk would be a kind of lie right now. I made a fire small enough to be invisible from 50 yards. She sat beside it and drank about half the canteen without stopping, and I didn't say anything about that because she needed it. I handed her the jerked meat and hardtack, and she ate with a focused efficiency that told me she hadn't had food since at least the morning. When she was done, she set her hands in her lap again, the same way she'd sat in the wagon, and she looked at the fire. "What's your name?" she said. "Del Harker." She nodded. "Why'd you do it?" I thought about what to say to that. "Your cup was tipped over," I said, "and the lock was too good for the wagon." She looked at me then. I'm not sure she knew what I meant by that, but something in it satisfied her enough that she didn't push. "We split the watch." She offered, and I let her take the first 2 hours, which surprised her a little. I could see it. Most men wouldn't have. I was too tired to perform courtesy, and also I had looked at her and decided she was the kind of person who could hold a watch, which she was. She woke me clean at the right time, told me she'd heard a coyote at the south end of the draw and nothing else, and went to sleep wrapped in the spare blanket I'd given her. I sat with the rifle across my knees and watched the dark. She had a father, that's what I knew. He'd farmed up at Cutter Creek since 1869, 12 years, probably scratched it out of nothing, probably built something worth staying for, or she wouldn't have still been there when the taxman came. He'd died and left her a debt instead of a farm, and the county had sold her to cover it, and she'd sat in that wagon with her hands on her knees and her back straight, because that was the only thing left that was hers. I'm not a man who talks about things like that. I'm telling you now the way you tell things to yourself at 2 in the morning when you're watching the dark and there's nothing else to do with it. The plain fact of what had been done to her sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. Not rage. I was past the age where rage was my first response to anything. Something harder and quieter. The kind of feeling that makes a man go back and shoot a lock off a cage wagon at 6 in the evening, instead of riding north to Laramie like he'd planned. Good. The county man with his newspaper, the badge man with his bottle, the whole clean machinery of it, legal terms and proper liens and a good Sheffield lock on a cheap wagon. I watched the dark. We broke camp before first light. She was up when I started rolling my blanket, no complaint, no stiffness in how she moved, just a person getting on with it. We rode northeast that day. I was steering for a town called Mead's Crossing, which was maybe 60 miles off and had a real law office. a federal marshal I'd had dealings with once, a man named Estabrook who was the genuine article. I had a thought about what I wanted to say to Estabrook and what a man with federal standing might be able to do about Birch the county man and his Masonic mug. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today was open country and 2 horses, and the sun climbing behind us and the grass going gold ahead. She rode well. The dun mare she had was cooperative but sluggish, and after about an hour Nora had figured out the horse's particular stubbornness and adjusted to it. A firm heel at exactly the right moment, a short check on the left rein before a drift started. Small corrections done early. I watched without watching. Around noon we stopped at a water hole to let the horses drink. She washed her face and the back of her neck and stood there looking north across the plain. The bruise on her cheekbone was sharper in the midday light, the yellow-green of old damage. I looked at it once and looked away. "Good do that," I said. "His man. When I wouldn't get in the wagon." I didn't say anything. "I hit him back," she said, "in the throat with my elbow." "Good." She looked at me, something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "You say that very flat." "I mean it flat, good." We ate at the water hole. She'd been quiet mostly, but there was a different quality to it today, not the wagon's stillness, which had been the silence of someone locked down inside themselves. This was a person comfortable with their own company, which is different, and I found I liked it. She told me some of it over the hardtack. Not all at once, a sentence here, a correction there, the way people actually tell things. The farm at Cutter Creek had been her father's from the start, 160 acres he'd proven up on when she was 12. Decent land, not great. He'd been a fair farmer and a poor businessman, which is a common enough combination in a man who trusts the soil more than he trusts other people. He'd borrowed twice against the land to survive 2 bad years, once in '76 and once in '79, and the interest had buried him. When he died last November, the debt was bigger than the land's assessed value. She'd known about the taxes. She'd gone to see Birch in December, offered to pay it out at 20 cents a month from the money she made taking in mending. Birch had been polite and essentially told her it wouldn't do. The formal remand had come in March. A man she'd never met before had shown up with that wagon and the badge man and a paper that had the county seal on it, and that had been that. 4 months in that wagon, moving between towns, she thought, though she'd been unable to see enough through the slats to be certain of the routes. Good had clients, she said. That was the word she used, clients. Men who paid good a fee to use her labor for various periods. She'd been a cook at a cattle camp for 6 weeks, a washerwoman at a ranch near the Cimarron for 3. She said it plainly, no drama in it. Then she said, he had plans for another kind of client next, and she stopped there. I didn't push, I didn't need to. The sky was enormous out there. 40 miles from Caldwell Flats, and the country opened up the way it does on the southern plains. Flat to the horizon in 3 directions. One low ridge to the northwest with a dark line of cedar along the top. And above it all the sky just going on forever, that specific shade of blue that you only get in June above Kansas. So clean it hurts. She looked up at it. I thought about this, she said. In the wagon, open sky. I'd look up through the gaps in the canvas and there was a strip of it about 3 inches wide. I thought about the rest of it, what it felt like to be under all of it at once. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. We rode. The second night we camped on the ridge with the cedars. Better cover, long sight lines to the south. I still hadn't heard any pursuit, but I wasn't naive enough to think Good had simply accepted the situation. He'd paid money for a contract. Men like Good are persistent less out of anger than out of bookkeeping. She represented a debt in his ledger, and debts don't go away because you don't feel like collecting them. She cooked that night. She'd found some early wild onions along the ridge coming up and had them in her pocket, and with the dried meat and a small fire she made something that was considerably better than what I'd been eating for 2 weeks. We sat with tin cups of creek water. I had no coffee left, and ate and didn't talk much. After she said, "You were going to Laramie." "Eventually. I heard you tell the livery man when you first came in. You'd mentioned Laramie." I hadn't known she could hear that. The livery man had been maybe 20 feet from the wagon. "Going to see a man about work," I said. "Ranch work wasn't urgent." "So you've turned yourself around for this." I looked at the fire. Meade's Crossing's north, Laramie's north. "That's not an answer." I looked at her then. She was watching me with that same measuring quality she'd had when she first stepped out of the wagon, the look of a person taking a fair account of what's in front of them. "No," I said, "it isn't." She nodded slowly, not pressing for more, just acknowledging that I'd said the true thing instead of the convenient one. Third morning we found water and I shot a jackrabbit and she skinned it before I'd gotten back from checking the horses, quick and clean like a person who'd been doing that since childhood, which she had. We ate well. The horses were holding up. The country was starting to take on a different character, less flat, more roll to it, the beginnings of the terrain shifts that meant we were getting north. Mid-morning she said, "You have a family." "Not anymore. Wife. Died in 71. She was quiet a moment. "I'm sorry. Long time ago." Long time ago doesn't mean it doesn't matter. I looked at her. She was watching the country ahead, not me. She had a direct way of saying things, not rude, not soft, just the honest weight of a thought put into words. I'd noticed it back in that dry creek drawl the first night. She said what she meant and didn't dress it up. "No," I said, "it doesn't. We rode." I thought about Ellen a lot in those years after she died, the specific way she laughed, which was always slightly surprised, like humor caught her off guard even when she was the one being funny. The fact that she could read my mood from the set of my shoulders before I'd said a word. The particular silence of the house after. I'd left that house, sold it to a neighbor for what I could get and taken to the road, because the silence had a shape to it that I couldn't share a room with. 7 years of road. I'd worked ranches and line camps, and one summer a cattle drive up from Texas that I would not do again for any money. I'd kept to myself, which is easy to do if you don't push against it, and I hadn't pushed against it. Nora Kane rode beside me on the dun mare, and didn't need me to be anything in particular, which was more than I could say for most of the company I'd kept. We had one problem on day 4. We were crossing a shallow river ford, the Sweetwater tributary, maybe 15 miles south of Meade's Crossing, when 2 riders came up fast from the east. I saw them at about 400 yards and put a hand out to slow Nora, and we let the horses wade to the far bank, and I got us behind a stand of cottonwoods and waited. One of them was the badgeman from Caldwell Flats. I recognized the horse, a blood bay with a white sock on the right fore. The other man I didn't know, lean and young, riding hard. They were tracking, looking at the ground, moving fast. I said to Nora, "Stay behind these trees, don't move the horse." She looked at me. "What are you going to do?" "Talk to them first. And if talking doesn't work, then we find out." She held my eye for a second, and then she nodded once, short, the nod of a person who trusts your judgment without losing their own. "Be careful," she said, just that. I rode out from the cottonwoods and sat my roan in the open at the near bank of the ford. They pulled up when they saw me, about 60 yards. Badgeman recognized me. I could see it in the way he straightened. "Harker," he said. "Still wearing that pin?" I said. "You took property of a lawful contract." "I took a woman out of a cage who hadn't been charged with a crime. You can call that what you want." The young man beside him had his hand near his gun. Fresh, nervous, the kind of nervous that can go wrong fast. I kept my eyes on him. "You're going to hand her over," Badgeman said. "Good's got a legal claim." "Good's got a debt claim against a dead man," I said. "That doesn't transfer to the dead man's daughter. You and your county man both know that, which is why you were moving her around instead of filing paperwork. This whole thing falls apart in front of a federal judge, and you know it." He knew it. I could see him knowing it. But he had a man to answer to, and that mattered more to him right now than what was legal. "Last time I'm asking you to step aside," he said. "And I'm telling you Esterbrook at Meade's Crossing is going to hear every detail of what Birch and Good have been running. You want to be part of that when it comes apart, you keep riding north. Otherwise turn around and tell Good his contract's worth nothing." The young man's hand moved. Not drawing, just fidgeting, nerves again. But Badgeman was watching me, working through something behind his eyes. He was a man who had made arrangements in life rather than principles, and the arrangement he was looking at now had a federal marshal's name in it, and the math was changing on him. "This ain't over," he said. "It can be," I said. "Right now, just turn around." He held for another long moment. Then he said something to the young man I didn't hear, and they turned their horses and rode back east. I sat there until they were gone over a low rise, and then I let out a breath slow and rode back to the cottonwoods. She was right where I'd left her. She'd had a hand on the dun mare's nose, keeping her quiet. When I came through the trees, she looked at me with that measuring look, taking account. "They're gone," I said. "What did you say to them?" "Told them the truth." She was quiet for a second. "You said Estabrook's name." "I did." "You think that was enough to stop them?" "Good's operating on a legal gray edge, and he knows it. A federal inquiry ends him. Badgeman's not loyal enough to Good to go down with him." I paused. "And I think he was a little afraid." She looked at me steadily. Something had shifted in her face. "Of you." "Maybe." She said, "You knew he'd back down." "I thought he would." "That's not the same as knowing." "No," I said, "it isn't." She looked at me for another moment, that careful, level look. Then she said, "Thank you." Simple, no drama in it. But it was said the way a person says something they mean precisely, and the weight of it landed. We rode the last 15 miles into Meads, crossing that afternoon. Estabrook was there. He was a tall man, spare, with a gray beard cropped short and the kind of careful eyes that come from a long career of reading people quickly. He'd known me from a matter 3 years back involving a stolen horse herd and a man who'd tried to make it my problem, and he'd been straight with me then. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is a skill, and when I was done he sat back and laced his fingers and said, "Birch." "Birch," I said. "I've heard the name. He's got a safe with a county seal, and a newspaper, and a comfortable arrangement with a man named Good who's been running this at least since March." Estabrook looked at Nora. "Miss Kane, are you prepared to make a statement?" "Yes," she said, "all of it." He nodded. He looked at me. "You shot a lock." "I did." "Off a legal conveyance." "Off a cage," I said. "That held a woman who had committed no crime." He let that sit for a second. Then he said, "The contract was unenforceable on its face. Service indenture for a third-party debt without the subject's consent, been illegal under federal statute since 1867. Birch and Good knew that. They were counting on nobody withstanding raising it." He unfolded his hands. "I'll ride to Caldwell Flats in the morning. You two get some rest." He put us up in the rooms above the marshal's office, separate rooms, which he offered without comment, which I appreciated. There was a wash basin and a real bed, and I lay on it for an hour before I slept and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular. I heard her moving in the room across the hall. Just the ordinary sounds: water poured, boots set down, the particular sound of a person arranging themselves in a space that's theirs for the night. Small sounds, the sounds of a person not in a cage. I closed my eyes and slept the first full sleep I'd had in 4 days. She was up before me in the morning. She'd found the small kitchen off the marshal's common room, and there was coffee on the stove, black and real, and she was standing at the window with a cup in both hands looking out at the street. The morning light was coming at a low angle and caught the side of her face, and the bruise was fainter, just a shadow now. She heard me come in and turned and handed me a cup without a word. I took it and stood beside her, and we looked out at the street. After a while she said, "I've been thinking about the farm." "The Cutter Creek place." Estabrook said if the contract's void and the remand was illegal, the underlying debt instrument may be challengeable too. The land might not have been legally available for tax sale. I looked at her. "He said that?" "He said he'd look into it, this morning before you were up." She paused. "He said it would take time and a lawyer, and he couldn't promise." "But it's possible." "He said possible, yes." I thought about that. 160 acres at Cutter Creek. 12 years her father had worked it. Now maybe she could get it back, or maybe she'd get a fair accounting of what it was worth. Or maybe the whole thing would disappear into the machinery of county courts and federal inquiries, and she'd end up with nothing but the acknowledgement that she'd been wronged. "What will you do," I said, "while it's being sorted?" She turned from the window and looked at me. Full on, the way she had when she'd stepped out of that wagon and I'd said her name and given her the choice, taking a measurement. "I don't have anywhere particular to be," she said. "Do you?" I thought about Laramie, the ranch work, the man who'd written to say he might have something if I got up there. "Not urgent," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then you said that once before." "It was true then, too." Something came into her face then, not the measuring look, something warmer and quieter than that, something I hadn't seen on her before in the 4 days we'd ridden together. She'd been capable and direct and contained, all of which I respected entirely, but this was different. This was something that had come through the measurement and the accounting and landed somewhere on the other side of it. She'd been looking at me the way a person looks at a question they're working out, and somewhere between Caldwell Flats and this window with its 2 cups of coffee, she'd worked it out. She reached across and put her hand on my forearm, just her hand resting there easy, not asking for anything. Warm. I looked down at her hand and then at her face. "You're a decent man, Del Harker," she said. "I haven't met a lot of those." I didn't know what to say to that. I looked out the window. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." And she didn't push for more because she was the kind of person who understood what it means when a man looks away from something and can't find words. It doesn't mean nothing's there. It means the opposite. We stayed in Meads Crossing 4 days, while Estabrook rode to Caldwell Flats with a deputy and came back with Birch's papers and a set of questions for Good that Good would have to answer in front of a federal court. Estabrook told Nora the land was in abeyance, held pending the court review, which was better than gone. On the 4th evening, we sat on the steps of the marshal's office and watched the sun go down over the western plain. She'd bought a new dress from the dry goods, dark blue cotton, plain, practical, and she'd put her hair back up properly for the first time since I'd known her. I had a new shirt. We looked, I suppose, like ordinary people. "Laramie," she said. "Eventually. I've never been to Wyoming." I looked at the sky going orange above the horizon, that specific color you only get for about 10 minutes each evening before it shifts to dark red and then gray. "It's cold," I said, "even in summer." "I don't mind cold. High country, nothing like Kansas." "Good," she said. We sat there. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth of her arm next to mine without either of us touching. The street was quiet. Somewhere a door closed, and a horse stamped in the livery, and the light kept changing. I think about that step sometimes. That particular step of the marshal's office in Meads Crossing, Kansas. In June of some year, I no longer need to count. I think about how the world looks from that kind of ordinary quietness after the shooting is done, and the law is working, and there's coffee inside, and a woman beside you who has decided, of her own free and uncoerced will, that wherever you're going next is where she'd like to go. There wasn't a ceremony about it. She didn't make a speech. I didn't either. That was the thing neither of us needed to. She'd seen what I was in that Ford, 60 yards and 2 horses and a nervous young man's fidgeting hand. She'd seen it in the livery when I'd pressed the barrel against the shackle and told her she had a choice. She'd seen it in the way I'd let her take the first watch and asked her name before I asked her anything else. She had eyes that worked, and she'd used them and she'd decided. A good woman looking at a man she trusts, and I mean trust the way I mean it, the earned kind, the kind that comes from watching how someone moves when they're afraid and seeing that they move steadily. That is something no man who's been without it for a long time has adequate words for. He just knows when it's there. Her hand on my arm in the kitchen, that's the one I keep. We left for Laramie the next morning. She rode the dun mare, which Estabrook had located as belonging to a rancher west of Caldwell Flats who'd had it stolen 2 months back, and who was glad to know where it was, but who, when Estabrook wired him, said she could ride it to Wyoming and he'd collect it next spring. People will surprise you. The country north of Meads Crossing is different from the southern plains, bigger roll to it. The land starting to breathe differently, like it knows what's coming a few 100 miles ahead. The grass was tall and the sky was doing its thing, and we rode easy with no particular hurry on us. She told me about the farm as we went. Not the loss of it, she'd said enough about that, the farm itself. The creek and the Cutter Creek drainage that ran clean and cold even in August. The dark soil in the bottom field that would grow anything you put in it. The way the light hit the north ridge in the evening and turned the cedar bark the color of copper. She described it the way people describe things they love when they're not sure they'll see them again, carefully, making sure the detail is right, because the telling is a kind of keeping. I listened. I am good at listening, which is less common than it should be. She asked me about Ellen once, and I told her some of it, not the grief part, which was mine to keep, but Ellen herself. The way she'd read while she cooked, propping the book against the window above the stove, occasionally stirring without looking down. How she'd named the horses by character rather than appearance, which meant we'd had a gray called obstinate and a black called reasonable. The laugh that was always a little surprised. Nora listened the way she did everything, fully, with that quality of genuine attention that told you she wasn't just waiting for you to stop talking. "She sounds like she was worth knowing," Nora said. "She was. I'm glad you had that." I looked at her. She was watching the country ahead, riding easy, and what she'd said was exactly what it was, simple and true, and not trying to be anything other than that. No competition in it, no diminishment of the present by the past. Just one human being acknowledging another human being's good fortune, fully and without reservation. I had not expected, at 48 years old and 7 years of road, to find myself sitting in the kitchen of a federal marshal's office in Kansas, while a bruised woman with straight hands handed me a cup of real coffee and said, "Be careful," like she meant it. I had not expected to find myself grateful for the particular way a person's voice sounds when they're telling you about a creek they love. I had not expected the Ford, or the Cottonwoods, or the Badgeman and his arithmetic. I had not expected any of it. But that is the thing about the road. You can ride it with your head down for years, just putting miles between you and the empty house, and then one afternoon you come into a nowhere town to sell 2 horses and there is a tipped-over tin cup and a good Sheffield lock and a woman sitting straight-backed against the slats, and you either ride on or you don't. I didn't. Wyoming opened up ahead of us. Mountains in the distance, just a blue line, then a gray one, then the white teeth of the peaks coming up out of the horizon the way they do when you're close enough to understand their scale. Cold country and high country and country that doesn't forgive mistakes, which suited me. She rode at my side. Not behind me, not following. At my side, the dun mare pacing easy with the roan. 2 horses moving in comfortable parallel the way horses do when they've traveled together long enough to stop thinking about each other and just go. She was looking at the mountains. "Cold," she said. "Yes. Even in summer. Even in summer." She looked at them a moment longer. "Good," she said, same word she'd said in the kitchen. The same calm finality in it. A woman who had been caged deciding what she wanted out loud for herself in the open country. I let out a breath I might have been holding for 7 years. The mountains were still a long way off, blue-gray and cold and enormous above the plain. The horses moved steady underneath us. The day was wide open all the way to the horizon, and then wide open all the way beyond that, and we rode into it together, and that was enough. That was more than enough.